Well, dear chair, co-hosts, speakers, and participants, it is a privilege hosting this 2020 George Washington Memorial debate in such difficult times for us and for humanity. This current year, we are unable to have a presential session, but the fact that we are here linked, working together, translates two main important, decisive, and stimulating realities. The first, resilience. The Estoril Political Forum represents, under the strong leadership of Professor João Carlos Espada, the indestructible will of searching for solutions, particularly in periods when challenges are paramount. Second, technology. The accelerated development and use of technologies, like this one that we are using now, is allowing us solving the challenges of our times. Actually, the discovery and implementation of technologies is a sine qua non condition to allow humans to deal with sustainability of our planet so that generations of those who are alive and generations to come will be able to satisfy their needs with quality. Now on the theme of our debate. Being the United States of America, the strongest pillar of Western values, without which democracy will be in great dangers, the evolution of the United States plays a crucial role for the future of our civilization. And for those that carefully follow the recent, surprising, and worrying political evolution in the United States, the theme we are going to debate, America at the Crossroads, what path forward, is of the highest importance for the future of all of us and of all our beloved ones. Be welcome to this debate. And I now ask the co-host, Susan Schell, to address you.
Thank you very much. And I too would like to welcome you here and to thank João Espada especially, and all who have worked so hard to make the Estoril Political Forum so unusual and memorable conference this year. There are all too few occasions and opportunities for serious and thoughtful transatlantic conversation on topics of urgent and enduring importance. It's my special privilege and pleasure to host this evening or this afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in, a memorable debate, a memorial debate, I'm sure it will also be memorable, between our two distinguished speakers, William Galston of the Brookings Institution and William Kristol, founder and former editor of the Weekly Standard. Each is well known and each is distinguished for his substantial political accomplishments as for his important writings. And few, if any, could be in a better position than they to speak authoritatively on the topic of America's political future. It's been the special delight of those of us who live in Boston to be able to enjoy every 4 years Bill and Bill's postmortem on the US presidential election. But I have never before had the particular pleasure and privilege of a pre-mortem, an anticipation, as it were, of what we all fervently hope will prove to be the death merely of a presidential candidacy. A little more than humor here, which I guess has not raised many chuckles, I guess for good reason. This may well be for many Americans the most important presidential election of our lifetime. Certainly much hinges on its outcome, and for better or for worse, I think we have all become more aware of the fragility of even our most revered and long-standing democratic institutions, ones that are never to be taken for granted and that are all the more to be cherished. But now let me introduce our chair, Carl Wirchman, president of the National Endowment for Democracy and former senior counselor to the United States representative to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's a great pleasure to be here. This was to be a lecture, but when everything got rescheduled, it's not really a debate as much as it is a discussion, because I think there's probably a lot of agreement between Bill Galston and Bill Kristol. But let me first just introduce them very, very briefly and then open the discussion. Bill Galston holds the Zilka Chair in Governance Studies at Brookings Institution. He's the regular weekly columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He is the author of a book on the populist threat to liberal democracy. And he served in the 90s as for President Clinton as his deputy advisor on domestic policy. And Bill Kristol is, unlike Bill Galston, is a Republican. He is the founding director of Defending Democracy Together, and he was the founder and editor of the Weekly Standard, an important conservative magazine that no longer exists. And he also founded the Project for the Republican Future in the 1990s. And he served as the chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle during the administration of George H.W. Bush. Bill, as I said, Bill Galston is center left, Bill Kristol is center right, and yet they're both together today, I think, with a similar position, and we'll talk about that. Bill Kristol recently had a Biden ad with his namesake, Billy Crystal, the comedian, and they disagreed about everything except that they were both supporting Biden. So here we are at the George Washington discussion. And Washington, in his inaugural address, said something terribly important, which was that in his view, the preservation of what he called the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are deeply, perhaps finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. And we carried out that experiment. We succeeded in that experiment. But now the results of that experiment are of great danger to a concern to a lot of people. There's a recent poll that was published and written about in Foreign Policy magazine saying that 31% of Americans believe that a strong incumbent leader who does not have to bother with Congress and elections is preferable. So let me begin with Bill Kristol. Bill, maybe you could explain why you're supporting former Vice President Biden and what you think the path forward is and whether it's possible for us to recover that vision of George Washington.
You're muted, Bill.
Okay. Okay. Now I think I'm genuinely unmuted. Good to be with you all. Thanks, Carl, Susan, everyone else. And Bill Galston will be doing our thing at virtually, I guess, at Harvard in a little over 2 weeks. So we'll see how wrong we are, how wrong we might be today in our analysis. I mean, so this theme of America's experiment, let me say just a word about that. That's obviously key in the Federalist Papers, as well as in Washington's inaugural, Federalist One in particular. And when you read the Federalist Papers, and a lot of us have gone back to them, I think a fair amount in these last 4 years, as various things we took for granted seem to be called into question. One thing that in the US system of government that is set up to make sure this experiment can sustain itself, the first attempt to do so, the Articles of Confederation, failed. Let's not forget. So this is, this is not the spirit of the Federalists very much is that it remains an experiment. They were very aware that the first attempt to set up a working form of constitutional government that was strong enough to defend the country and hold the states together and also preserve liberties, this is not something easy to do. They hoped the Constitution would do better than the original Articles of Confederation. It has done better. When you read the Federalist Papers, and especially the last half on the different parts of government, it's really striking. I mean, I've studied them and wrote about them, but one forgets in a way how important the presidency is in their conception. The legislature might be more of a threat to liberty in certain ways, but they very much understood the importance of the presidency, a strong, if limited, presidency, strong energy in the executive, as Hamilton said. And there's really a lot of emphasis, a very high percentage of the pages on the presidency are about who will be president. Not so much about the powers of the presidency. There's some of that, of course, that's, treaties and, and so forth. But they really are concerned about the fact that let me put it this way, they are well aware that the system does not run in and of itself. They are well aware that you can have all the lovely constitutional arrangements you want. But if the one person in this extremely important job turns out to be radically unfit, you've got a big problem. And if you have a series of people who are radically unfit, you've got a really big problem. There's a lot of discussion of the Electoral College. Some of this is now obsolete, of course, of the Electoral College and how that's going to probably make it harder for demagogues to assume the presidency. And for me, this moment, and whatever the other flaws of America, and also whatever the other flaws of other parts of the system and the changes that were made, of course, with the Civil War and afterwards, that is something that certainly post-Civil War, I would say, has stood up pretty well. We've had presidents who were flawed and who weren't so great and made big mistakes, but we haven't really had out and out demagogues who had a total disdain for this constitutional system, for the rule of law, and I would even say really for the basic institutions and norms of liberal democracy. I think that's what we have in Trump. I saw that, I think, when I opposed him in 2015, 16. There was a minute of hoping that maybe he would grow into the office. That didn't happen. There was more than a minute of hoping that he would be checked much more effectively than he has been by his own party, the Republican Party. That hasn't happened. And so now we're looking at the possibility of a second term for a demagogue who has his own party under control, and his own party controls, one of the two branches of Congress. That's a recipe for genuine danger, in my view, to the experiment, to the ongoing experiment, a second term for Donald Trump.
Thank you, Bill. Let me just turn to Bill Galston for a moment to talk about this danger. Bill, Bolivia had an election on Sunday. It's already been resolved and resolved peacefully. But right before the election, one of the political analysts was quoted as saying, despite the differences between Bolivia and the United States, and Bolivia is a country that since its founding, its independence in the 19th century, had about 200 coups. And the analyst said that really the country, Bolivia and the United States, are very similar today in terms of polarization and claims of fraud ahead of the vote. I mean, what has happened to our country, Bill? And can we recover? I mean, if we're looking at the path ahead, is it possible for the United States to get back on the right path and to stay there?
I believe it is, but it won't be quick and it won't be easy. Let me explain. And I want to go back to exactly the same document that Bill Kristol took as his point of departure, namely the Federalist Papers. And I want to refer in particular to the man that I regard as the greatest of the founders, namely James Madison. And it is a matter of historical record that James Madison did not plan for a party system in the United States. He emphatically did not want a party system. His vision, is laid out in Federalist Paper number 10 and elsewhere, was that there would be a large number of groups with different interests and perhaps even different visions of the national good, and that these groups would enter into ever-shifting alliances with one another. That was the Madisonian vision. Within a decade, it was completely obsolete. We had a party system developed within the constitutional framework, although not prescribed by the constitutional framework. We have the minimum number of political parties that a functioning constitutional democracy requires, namely 2. And much depends on how those 2 political parties relate to each other. Our constitutional system can work when the 2 political parties do not regard each other as mortal enemies and existential threats to everything they hold dear. But if the 2 political parties come to be so different and so opposed and so deeply fearful of each other, then our constitutional system either grinds to a halt or succumbs to grave distortions. And let me just say a word about that. As everybody knows from American government textbooks and simple observation, we have three major branches of government, and each one has its own job to do. There are overlapping functions, of course, but still, the main business of the Supreme Court is to judge, and the main business of the Congress is to legislate, and the main job of the president is to implement in domestic policy and lead in foreign policy. What happens when the Congress of the United States, because of polarization between the two political parties, can no longer do its job? The answer to that question is writ large before us. Some powers migrate to the Supreme Court, which then becomes an area of intensified contestation. Other powers migrate to the executive with fewer checks on executive power than the founders contemplated. And there's this void at the heart of our constitutional system. That is where we are right now. And the question is, to get back to Carl's question, how do we get out of this? And I'll name the year that gives me hope. The year is 1800, which arguably was the most ferociously polarized presidential election in American history. Thomas Jefferson took office. He intentionally created a tone of depolarization with his first inaugural address. We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans, being one of the great lines. And within just a few years, barely more than a decade, the United States had entered what historians call the era of good feeling, when intense competition between the political parties died down. Of course, one of the political parties died, which helped. Perhaps we need to return to that model. So American history, to sum up, has gone through cycles of cooperation and contestation. It's gone through periods where the executive shrank beyond its appropriate bounds, and the Congress became this rapacious vortex into which too many powers were sucked. We're now in the opposite situation. I think we can recover, but recovery will begin with leadership from the top. Everything depends on the tone that whoever is inaugurated president sets on January 20th of 2021.
So assuming, Bill, that as the polls now make it look possible, that Biden is going to win, I mean, the question is, he's going to face a lot of difficulties in trying to bring our system back to even keel. I mean, do you think he can do it?
Well, I hope he can. I don't know whether he can, but let me unpack your question a little bit, Carl. Going back to the proposition that I put on the table, that we have the minimum number of political parties that a constitutional democracy requires, it follows that in a continental republic, filled with every kind of diversity imaginable, that each of these two political parties will be a broad coalition. One of the leaders of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, Ocasio-Cortez, said a couple of months ago that in a European parliamentary system, she and Joe Biden would not be members of the same political party. She's absolutely right. The Biden coalition extends now from the center right to the socialist left of American politics. Managing this coalition will be a huge challenge. And if he tries to reach out to the center right too aggressively, he will be challenged on the left. He has done a pretty good job so far in his campaign of managing an extremely diverse coalition, but the job will only get harder if he is elected president and brings in a Democratic-dominated House of Representatives and Senate along with him.
Bill, Crystal now. Would you comment on that? And also, Bill, if you could take up the really important question of whether the Republican Party can move to become, again, a center-right party as opposed to a populist party more the way it is right now. Do you think it's possible to reclaim that center-right space, which would mean reaching out, I think, to new constituencies? Is that possible?
So that's a big question. I think it's important what Bill Galston said, though, and your question led him in this direction, to focus on, let's put it this way, here in the US, especially in my world of Republicans and former Republicans and anti-Trump Republicans and semi-anti-Trump Republicans and Trump Republicans, huge amount of debate, future of the Republican Party, as you just suggested. But people are not sufficiently focused on the fact that Joe Biden, presumably, if he wins, will be president, and what he does will affect that future probably more than any academic discussion between different kinds of populists or jockeying in Congress among different senators, both in the sense Bill mentioned. I mean, can he hold his party together? But also, is he successful or not? I mean, if you just think ahead for the next successful just in the sense of like being, quote, a successful president, i.e., we get the virus under control, we get the economy going again, no foreign policy disasters, hopefully, and so forth. I think it's pretty important for the country. I mean, a failed Biden presidency, and even if this is not at all his fault, let's just assume there are huge exogenous factors that make it very hard for the next president to succeed. We'll be inheriting a tough situation, obviously. Then you're really looking at a kind of turmoil that would really worry me a lot. I mean, we've gotten a Trumpified Republican Party, even after admittedly real big problems in 2008 and difficulties with Iraq and stagnant incomes, and Bill's written a lot about this, but still, even without, let's say, a really terrible, economic situation or really kinds of disasters one can imagine. And I do think the system is weaker than it was. I guess I like Bill's formulation about the void. The parties were unanticipated. They came up, they got incorporated. There was a kind of de facto new constitutional system with the modern parties and the branches of government in a kind of complicated relationship. It probably was getting hollowed out for the last 20, 30 years, more than some of us realized. Bill, I think, was earlier on this than I was, and seeing how dangerous the polarization was, the partisanship, the ceding of power to the executive branch from Congress, et cetera. But with President Bush, George W. Bush, and then President Obama, there was a kind of, the people in charge were still respectful of the system, and at key moments in the country's history, I think, tried to make things work and not polarize more than necessary. You can see it in the something simple like the presidential transitions, where there was, Bush went out of his way to make it as easy as possible for Obama. Obama went out of his way to make it reasonably easy, I guess, for President Trump, even though that was harder. But you did see, I mean, beneath the surface, it was getting hollowed out. But now we've had 4 years of President Trump, and I think the customs that have come, that he's brought to the new norms or destruction of norms he's brought to the surface and so forth, especially on the Republican side, they won't just go away. So to get to your question, I mean, I don't know. I'm mildly pessimistic in the short term about, a Republican return to sanity or to what I would regard as a constructive form of conservatism. I just think it's one thing after you nominate a candidate who's too extreme, he loses badly. Goldwater 64 would be the instance, McGovern 72. I mean, these were both decent people, but they were out of the mainstream. And the party snapped back reasonably quickly and didn't, they absorbed some elements of those messages and were competitive very quickly thereafter, really 2 years thereafter almost. And I wouldn't say those spirits dominated. They had lingering effects, and Reagan, of course, being a Goldwater champion in some ways, more than lingering effects, but still they didn't really define the parties exactly. But neither was president. I mean, Trump will have been president. Someone else, a friend of mine, said, couldn't this be, he was trying to be optimistic from my point of view, and said, look, it could be like Labour in Great Britain. You have a really, from my point of view, not really a bad leader of Labour, way outside the post-World War II Labour mainstream, really terrible on some issues that I care a lot about. And he led the party. I think Corbyn led the party for 4 or 5 years. I mean, he wasn't a short-term leader, but he was never prime minister. And he lost. And one has the impression, and I'm not a there are people on this call who follow British politics much more closely than I do. I had the impression that the Corbynism has been shook off to a pretty substantial degree by the new Labour leader and by the party as a whole. They sort of want to put it behind them and move on. But Corbyn wasn't prime minister for 4 years, and prime ministers aren't even presidents. And Trump's ability to get the party to go along with him, that has been the key. For me, the key story, I'll just take a minute on this because I think it is kind of important. The key story isn't that Trump won the Republican nomination. That's important. It tells you a few things about the party, but it was a little bit flukish. And everyone's always understood that a party, especially the modern primary process, could produce odd nominees. It just happens in multi-candidate races. Key thing, in my view, isn't even that he won the general election. That could always happen in a two-party race when people are tired of the incumbent party after 8 years and an fairly or unfairly, an unpopular opponent, and he gets lucky in the Electoral College, and Comey decides to reopen the investigation 10 days out, and the Russians meddle and so forth. For me, but look, do this thought experiment. What does it look like if Trump becomes president, but the Republican Party in Congress behaves as I think previous parties might have behaved in previous times and not simply gone along with everything? I mean, I was in the George H.W. Bush White House. We faced opposition from Republicans from the left, from the right, for regional reasons, for idiosyncratic reasons. And we thought nothing of it. That was just part of being in the White House. Bill had the same problem with Democrats when he worked for Bill Clinton. And that was just life. And then incidentally, if you wanted to get something passed, you often did it in a bipartisan way. We did the Clean Air Act and other things. Clinton did stuff in the welfare reform in 95, 96. I mean, that was sort of just that the Congress had its own representatives, senators and members of Congress who were elected by constituents. They didn't think they worked for the president. The degree of capitulation by the Republican Party in Congress, which in turn meant the degree of capitulation by Congress, since they control both branches for the first 2 years and still control the Senate. Or capitulation might be not quite the right word, but collusion, let's say, since they got some things they wanted to. That has changed the dynamic. So if you had a Republican Party and conservative elites, business elites, donors, intellectual elites that had resisted Trump, not as much as I have, not in a kind of never Trump way, but sort of very qualified support, looked around maybe for a primary challenge, as Democrats did in 1980 against Carter, and sort of made clear they weren't really on board a lot of this stuff, and some of it was really deplorable, and they weren't going to quite vote to impeach, but they were certainly had real problems, but none of that. And then the barriers within the executive branch have been gradually dismantled, and so we are where we are. But again, that makes me go rather pessimistic. I mean, the Republican Party can't simply snap its fingers and say, okay, well, that was a little wacky, I mean, you can say that if you had a candidate who was a little odd for a few months and who lost, and you nominally supported him, but you didn't care much. You can say it if you had a president whom you sort of opposed half the time, or a third of the time, or a fifth of the time from Congress. You can't really say that if you had a president whose renomination you supported, you didn't have any interest in a primary challenge, and you supported him on every key moment in his legislative, in his struggles with the Democratic Party. And now a very high percentage of them have internalized Trump's rhetoric, Trump's manner of politics, and even some of Trump's views. So that's why I'm worried about the near future. It's bad for the country. We need to have a responsible center-right party and a responsible center-left party. It's one of the good things about America that we've had that. And I'm not so confident that the Republican comeback will be quite as easy as some of my friends hope.
Well, there are problems on both sides, Bill, and I want to raise two more questions, and we will get to questions from the audience. But I just want to pose two more questions to both of you. The first has to do with what you just implied, which is how do we rebuild a center in the United States today, which is such a deeply polarized country. Just earlier this month, our friends out at Stanford, Larry Diamond and Frank Fukuyama, started a new publication called The American Purpose. And Bill, you know about the importance of publications. You created the Weekly Standard. Your father understood the importance of journals. And Frank Fukuyama said that the purpose of this new journal was to try to create a space between right-wing populism that you've just described and woke progressivism, which is an increasing force on the left and pretty dangerous. And how do you do that? Because, I mean, there are a lot of deeply polarized countries around the world, including Israel. How do you rebuild a center? I want you, Bill Crystal, first to answer that, and then we'll turn to Bill Galston.
So I think political leadership is crucial, much as I love journals and journalism and intellectual efforts. I will say on the intellectual side, I've been somewhat encouraged in the last year or two after being 2 or 3 years ago. Well, Bill Galston and I did this little project, the New Center Project in 2017. It tried to show that there was a possibility of centrist public policy solutions on more issues than people thought. I think we showed that as proof of concept that you could come up with such things. I wouldn't say there was much of a political market for it then. And even intellectually, Trump just distorted everything so much that people would listen to us respectfully, and I think find it interesting and immediately get back to not irrationally, incidentally, debating whatever the latest outrage was in terms of the Constitution or Trump, coddling dictators or so forth. So I mean, it was a little hard to get a hearing for this. I am cheered up a little by the emergence on the center left and center right, I think, of people who understand that liberal democracy matters most, that the particular tax rates or the kind of healthcare plan you have is a little less important than defending the core institutions and norms of liberal democracy, that needs defense. And so you have various publications. These days, I don't even know if they're called websites, newsletters, many things by people who are friends of many of us, sort of in this space. So I feel actually on the intellectual side, there's a bit of a prompted by both by Trump and by the polarization of the last 20, 30 years, bit of a reawakening of, hey, it's fine. You could be conservative on this and interventionist on this, and you could be more or less interventionist on this aspect, and you can have different views about certain aspects of how campaigns should be financed. But, could we just defend liberal democracy here and make sure that we have a healthy system and not let it just ignore all of this and let it be pried apart by partisans and taken advantage of by demagogues? I feel like that sense is greater than it was. So that I'm slightly optimistic about. Politically, how that manifests itself in each party or between the two parties, or could you have a coalition of the centrist coalition that works with people in both parties? Conceivably, could you have a new party? I think those are big. That I'm much less certain about. That is, I think, dependent on particular leaders, not just the president, but particular senators, governors, others who see this as a moment to do in the political side what I think is happening to some degree on the intellectual side.
Thanks. Bill Galston?
Let me pick up that challenge briefly. I've spent the past 10 years of my life working with an organization of Democrats, Republicans, and what we call in the United States independents, people who don't identify with either major political party, to try to create some real political leadership around the idea of a center coalition that would be willing to work with reasonable people and ideas from both political parties. As things now stand, we have recruited a functioning bipartisan caucus in the House of Representatives with 25 Democrats and 25 Republicans who have indeed operated as a bloc. They most recently came up with the legislative proposal for COVID-19 relief that broke the deadlock and initiated a period of bargaining that has substantially narrowed the difference between the two political parties. And we have a group of 8 senators now who are in the early stages of preparing to serve the same function, play the same role in the Senate of the United States. These groups could be very useful for a president who, like Joe Biden, who was brought up in a tradition of bipartisan cooperation, who has spent nigh on 5 decades in national public life, not demonizing most members of the other party, but indeed working with them. He was President Obama's emissary to Mitch McConnell because Obama and McConnell, just couldn't bear each other and refused to meet with each other for the most part. So the combination of a center coalition in the Congress and a president who genuinely wants to cooperate in that fashion across party lines could make a difference. But it takes two to tango. And if the Republican Party in 2021 finds itself in the minority in the Senate as well as the House, then the Senate minority leader will have to decide whether he simply wants to oppose or whether he is willing to meet the new president halfway. In some ways, that will be the single most important political decision that any leader of either political party makes. If Senator McConnell decides that he is not going to try to do to Biden what he announced he would do, but did not succeed in doing with Barack Obama, namely making him a one-term president by saying no to every turn, then we have a chance of beginning to dig our way out of this. But if we go back to what I think is just mindless and destructive oppositionism, a trait which is not confined to one political party, I hasten to add, then Bill Kristol's pessimism, I think, would be warranted.
You wrote last week about William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech. I mean, are the Republicans in danger now of falling into that trap of becoming kind of a permanent minority party?
Well, my argument is that there are some interesting parallels between William Jennings Bryan and Donald Trump, and the parallels, I think, are less in point of personal character. The two are nothing alike along that dimension, but because the coalitions that they represent do not represent the demographic future of the country. William Jennings Bryan in 1896 stood for agriculture against industry and small towns against big cities. He also stood for a kind of white Protestant hegemony, which was being weakened by waves of immigration that brought so many people in this discussion from Europe to the United States, or the parents and grandparents of people in this discussion. And so if you just look at long-term trends, a Republican Party that does not reach out beyond its base would end up as a permanent minority party. That was what the famous autopsy after the 2012 Mitt Romney defeat said very clearly. And Donald Trump rejected, not just in effect, but in his very person, he rejected that path in favor of the kind of path that he has followed and down which he has led his party. So I think the Republican Party is faced with the challenge either of changing and broadening, or yes, risking becoming a permanent minority party.
I just want to shift the discussion quickly to international affairs and note that yesterday, in his opening address to this conference, Jose Manuel Barroso, who is the president of the European Commission and also the Prime Minister of Portugal, in his opening remarks to the conference, which is a very powerful speech, he said that in terms of transatlantic relations today, we are in the worst moment, he said. He used the term the worst moment that he can remember. And he said there have been previous bad moments, in 1966 for NATO when France withdrew from the NATO's integrated military command. He mentioned problems with Turkey and Cyprus, but he said nothing has been like this today. And he attributed it in large part to the current U.S. administration. And he said there was a real problem of trust. Can that trust be restored, or is there going to be a permanent problem now between Europe and the United States? Bill Galston, why don't you begin, and then we'll turn to Bill Kristol.
I think it can be restored to some extent, but not completely. Let me explain why. For 70 years after the Second World War, The assumption was that politics in the United States would be conducted within certain limits. You could get center right presidents or center left presidents, but they disagreed to some degree, but they did not disagree on fundamentals. All of the presidents during that period believed in the transatlantic alliance, some more fervently than others, and all of them invested time, energy, and the time of senior subordinates in nurturing and maintaining that alliance. Obviously, there were controversies over the years, but the understanding was that the controversies were within the family and that there was never any risk the family would break up. Some Europeans believe that the diminution of the American focus on the alliance began in the Obama administration. There's something to that, although there's also something to the fact that the rise of China inevitably has divided American attention in new ways. We're in a new phase now. It's not like the 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. America as a global power now has to pay a lot of attention to China and East Asia, and there's more likely to be a crisis or two there than in Europe. So there will be a split focus, and Europeans will now always understand that there are disquieting potentials in American politics that have been revealed by the Trump presidency that it's a bell that can't be unrung. It's a genie that can't be put back into the bottle. And Europeans will now have to worry about the United States in a way that they didn't have to worry about the United States for 70 years.
Yeah, I know. Anne Applebaum recently wrote that even if Biden chants the old mantras, she said, everyone knows that his successors might not, and she said even President Tucker Carlson might flip everything up in the air again. So, Bill Kristol, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you can't unring the bell. On the other hand, I don't know what metaphor we want, or you can, if the bell stops ringing for quite a while, on the other hand, the silence is welcome, and you could rebuild.
That's right.
I'm not. I think international affairs will be a very good test for what Bill was talking about earlier, though. How does the Republican Party now see itself in Congress, especially the Senate, which has special responsibilities in foreign policy? I mean, does it see itself, do it just routinely? And I'd say right now, their mindset, even the ones who are not the Trumpiest by any means, the mindset is oppositional. They kind of vaguely assume, if you woke one of them up, what are you going to be doing in January or February, assuming Trump loses, assuming you lose the majority in the Senate? I'll be opposing the Biden administration on this or that. I'll be screaming and yelling about some cabinet nominee who has something in his or her background I don't like. Now, I think most of them, that's just kind of what they think politics is. That's been politics for most of their experience at this point. And even the senior people, McConnell, who you'd think, well, they could think back to an earlier age. He came to the Senate in '85. They haven't been a good example in that respect. So I'm worried that we'll just go into knee-jerk opposition, basically. There'll be, find some scandal. It'll be sort of Benghazi-esque politics and Hunter Biden-esque politics, maybe not quite as bad, and it'll be very hard to therefore reassure people in Europe and Asia, but also just bad for any prospect of serious rebuilding at home. Maybe I'm underestimating that, though. Trump has been such a huge, or overestimating the danger of that. Trump has been such a huge figure, really, in his own way, that I think it is just analytically hard to know what happens if he loses and leaves the scene. Well, does he leave the scene? But whatever he does post-presidency, but what is his impact as a post-president who might have lost fairly badly even? What is the impact of his favorite news organizations, of his family, of those who want to inherit his mantle? Well, how do other people navigate between Trump on the one hand and parts of the establishment and a future at a party that could get to a majority status again on the other? I mean, these are huge questions. We don't really have a very good historical, basis for analyzing that. We just haven't really had anyone much like Trump, who's such an outsized figure in his own way, both totally dominating his own party and his own side of the aisle, but also not liked much by a lot of them. So how does that work out when he leaves? I could argue that either way, that he, in a way, the removal of Trump could be a huge thing, or unfortunately, from my point of view, people shouldn't get their hopes up too high on how much his defeat would change things. I think we really don't know. A lot will depend on real leadership, real people emerging. It's not going to happen automatically. I guess that's the one thing I would say. If every Republican senator is looking around for someone else to be the person who says, you know what, I basically agree with what Biden's doing here. I've got two or three important suggestions that I think can improve this policy, and I'm going to offer those as amendments. I'm not making this up, but you know what I mean, on the floor, but I want to work with them and make it better. If that could become self-fulfilling, but someone needs to step up. And right now, the dynamics of American politics don't reward that. I want to say one word about Europe and Asia too, for that matter, just on the alliance structure. One thing that's totally underappreciated, in my opinion, in the US is our allies in Europe, much as we've all complained about them for decades, and I'm certainly one who has too at times, both in government and out. They have done a good job these last few years of keeping things together when there were plenty of, without much help from the American president, and with plenty of provocations where they could easily have just said, I'm not putting up with this anymore. Someone told me a story the other day, someone who was in the Trump administration, which I won't go into, but of a NATO summit and Trump's behavior and the degree to which Stoltenberg and Merkel and Macron, I think it was Theresa May at this point, just decided, look, we're going to pretend this is okay. We're not going to repeat what he said in here. We're going to give him a little bit of a PR victory by saying we're increasing our defense spending, even though they already were increasing it, that whole issue. And we're going to make this thing hang together and work, because we do not want the U.S. to withdraw from the world, and we can, or from the alliance structure, we don't want to imperil it. And we can sort of cobble this together for 4 years. That's one reason why 4 years of Trump is potentially so different from 8 years. So I don't believe they could do that for another 4 years. But I would give them a lot of credit. I give Abe a lot of credit from Japan. I mean, our allies could have gotten much more domestic reward at times by lashing out in response to Trump after he lashed out at them. And they've sort of mostly held their hand and tried hard to keep things together, which does mean, I think, that the next president, if Joe Biden wins, that he inherits a somewhat better situation than one might have expected, given how irresponsible our president has been at times.
And also, I mean, there are some really interesting developments taking place in Europe and in Russia today. I mean, I think what's happened in Belarus is absolutely remarkable and hopeful. And Russia, actually, Putin today seems somewhat in trouble. I mean, this is not necessarily because of anything the U.S. did, but and the European Union is beginning to unite a little bit more. So there's hope there. Let me just ask before I have some additional questions, but I want to know from Rita or anyone who's watching this and receiving questions from the audience. Are there any questions from the audience, or should I just proceed? Rita, do you have any questions?
Yes, hello. There are quite a few questions from the audience. I have tried to cut these down, and I had tried to join some of them together because they are interlinked. So if you don't mind.
Why don't you just read them all, and then the two bills will answer whichever ones they want to answer.
Okay, perfect. So I will try and read. I will try to read them all then. So one of the questions is from Mark Ugo Stan. He's a
You don't have to get into the detail of
okay,
who
fine.
asked it.
Okay,
we don't have much time. Just very quickly, what are the questions?
Perfect. So the last 4 years, we've seen a reduction of terrorism and American intervention in the Middle East. Is it a Trump accomplishment? Then,
okay.
What is the role of the USA in the world? The Trump administration has not started any new wars. Shouldn't we celebrate this?
Okay.
Isn't the party polarization of today nor a reflection of the deep social division that transcends the current politicians? What is the main reason for the US being so polarized? And if Mr. Biden wins the elections, could there be a pseudo-civil war? If confirmed, could the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to SCOTUS be an important determinant of the election of November 3rd? What can we expect from Amy Coney Barrett if Trump eventually loses and takes it to the SCOTUS? Assuming that even in a worst case scenario for him, President Trump should still get 30%, which is a substantial share of the national vote, which are the main reasonable motivations that you can think of that lead so many US voters to support him?
All right, not too many more because they
Okay.
only have 3 or 4 minutes.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. Then we should start with these, yes.
Okay, a few questions. Listen, maybe we'll do it in the reverse order. So we'll start with, we started with Bill Kristol at the beginning. So we'll start with Bill Galston now. You want to try your hand in 3 or 4 minutes and trying to capture these questions and answering them if you can, Bill?
I'll do my best. Why 40% for President Trump? Well, I'll give you the standard political scientist's answer, and that is that in the American party system, your so-called partisan identification, whether you think of yourself as a Republican or a Democrat, is the single biggest determinant of your vote. So that's the first part of the answer. And the second part of the answer is that President Trump has kept many of his promises to his party. I won't go into the long list of things that he has done that he said he would do in his election, but many people who supported them the first time believe that he has delivered on his promises. And that too, I think, helps to explain his support. Will there be a civil war? If Mr. Trump loses? No, I don't think so. There may be some scattered disruptions, and certainly the fact that the United States is so excessively well armed, without the constitutional justification of a well-regulated militia, which the Supreme Court has written out of the Constitution, but don't get me started on that one. I don't think it will come to civil war at this point. 4 years from now, if Bill Kristol's disaster scenario comes to pass, who knows? Isn't there a basis for partisan polarization that goes beyond the leadership of the two political parties? There certainly is, and I've spent the past 15 years of my life trying to explain it. Suffice it to say that there are demographic divisions in the country, economic divisions, cultural divisions, each of which has contributed over a period of many decades to the intensification of partisan polarization. And so this is not something that's going to go away quickly because it does have deep roots in the American economy and the American society. What about the Middle East? Shouldn't we celebrate the fact that there have been no new wars? It would be churlish of me to object to the absence of wars. And so I will simply say that during the Trump administration, the 9/11 era came to an end. One of many things that came to an end during the Trump administration. That is a politics driven by the memory of 9/11 and by the felt need in both political parties to take action in the part of the world where 9/11 originated and was devised. And all I can say is I hope very much that bad actors like Iran do not make it necessary for the United States to re-engage militarily.
Thank you, Bill. Bill Kristol?
It was impressive that Bill Galston did that all in 3 minutes.
Well, let's see how you can do.
I would say, so let me talk about polarization, which does get to several of the questions. I mean, I think there are many deep sociological, cultural, economic reasons for both anxieties and distrust, hostilities even among Americans, and polarization. And it's all now come together somehow so that the polarization is a polarization, not just of different views of policy, not even just of different regions. That's not new in America, but of really of hostility, really, and hostility to a degree that in the public that's become to me a bit alarming. Bill Galston and I were together, and I remember this was April of 2 years ago, 2018, because I remember this because it was the 50th anniversary of Robert Kennedy's assassination. I don't think it wasn't an event for that. It was a talk at Berkeley, as I recall, just a normal sort of speech, but debate or analysis like this. But it happened to be that day, and one of the questioners mentioned that and asked, is the country worse off or better off than we were in 1968? Because then it was riots and it was assassinations, and you could argue much worse, but in other ways, we made it through that, and there was some progress in those years, obviously, civil rights and other things. And I think Bill was the one who said something like, that he thought Washington was more broken, but the country today, but the country was healthier. We didn't have anything approaching the social or civic crisis that we had in 1968, but we did have a real Washington crisis in terms of Congress being broken, the parties being broken, and so forth. And the polarization was in Washington and more of a political problem. And I guess I agree with that. I am a little, I think you also said at the time, and I probably did too, that of course, if your politics stays broken long enough, it can infect society and culture, and they get broken too. And I think we have seen this over the last 2 or 3 years. So if I would have said 3 or 4 years ago, look, people in this country, I mean, there's some segregation now of political views, of economic and educational strata, and so forth, the coast and the center. But, people are very used to dealing with people they don't agree with. They're pretty used to dealing with people who don't look like them, for God's sake, by now in America, if they work in major workplaces and so forth, if they've been in the military or many, many places, right? And, they're not going around killing each other, frankly, and for all the hostility in Washington, a lot of it is not replicated at state and local level. Local governments have continued to function pretty well, state governments somewhat well. I would have said that with more confidence 3 or 4 years ago than I do today. I think the polarization has percolated, and the hostility and the hatreds really have percolated down, mostly from Washington to state and local levels, and to the culture and to civic society, civil society, in ways that I wouldn't have expected and that are alarming. You just turn on the TV and look at people in these crowds. And now maybe it's all kind of a game. Someone said that on Trump's daughter, I think, said this the other day, that, it's just the high spiritedness of the rallies when they chant, lock them up. But really, I mean, if you would tell me that tens of thousands of Americans would just be chanting, an authoritarian chant about someone who's not been charged with a crime, lock her up or lock them up, or especially, of course, if they're women or people of color and so forth, I would have said no. And maybe in some fringe areas, but not in the rallies of the president of the United States, to which a lot of people are going who are not fringe people, in the sense that they're employed, they're not as poor as people, they're not as, they seem to have, they're able to take time off and go to these rallies and so forth. Anyway, so I'm somewhat more alarmed about the polarization in that respect. Politics matters. And so I guess what I'll say in conclusion is the flip side of that, which is what I was thinking about as Bill spoke, which is politics matters on the downside and politics matters on the upside. And, we can have a pretty challenging technological changes and pretty challenging economic changes with globalization and a lot of cultural turmoil when the country goes from being 90% white to 70% white, and from being a Christian nation, more or less, to a much more diverse nation and secular and religious, etc. You can have all those things going on. With reasonable political leadership, we could navigate, I'm pretty certain, all those currents. I don't think they're that impossible or that challenging compared to some other things that we and other nations have navigated. But with mediocre leadership, it gets trickier. With positively bad leadership that exacerbates the problems, things can go south very quickly. So I do come back to where Bill began, actually, which is the importance of leadership in both parties and beyond the parties in the country over the next few years.
Thank you so much, Bill. That's a great note to end on, because I just want to say that, Marty Lipset, our dear friend Marty Lipset, he thought that there was no greater leader that our country had than George Washington. And we might not have gotten through that early period had it not been for George Washington. He wrote a great essay in the Journal of Democracy about that. And I'm not saying that we need to expect another George Washington to emerge in order to save the country now, But I take your point about leadership. It's actually critical, and it's the let us hope and pray that the crisis will lead to an opportunity for the emergence of leaders who can address the very, very dangerous problems that our country faces now. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Bill.
Carl,
thank you.
Carl,
Yes.
can I just add just a quick word? I don't know.
It's 2:31, so we got to be quick. Go ahead.
They're just two words that to me summarize much of what both Bills and Carl have said. One is trust. The fact that we've lost so much trust within our system and with our allies outside, and are we going to be able to regain that trust is really the fundamental question that we have to deal with for what is going to happen in the next phase of the history of the United States. And the other word is Trump. It's interesting that Trump's impact continues to be of profound importance, and particularly his impact on the Republican Party in what both of you have said is critical as to how the US is going to be able to develop in this phase after him. And yet his oversized impact during his administration continues in the phase afterwards, particularly with regard to the Republican Party.
Thanks very much. And this issue didn't come up, but we shouldn't ignore the impact of social media, which contributes to the division, and also the COVID crisis has contributed to the division. So this has been a great discussion. I want to thank everyone. A really terrific discussion. Bill Galston, Bill Christel. It's exactly what we wanted to memorialize George Washington and to talk about what I know is on everybody's minds today, which is which path forward for the United States, which is at a crossroads today. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.